This is called Christ the King Sunday. I don't know if you know that or you're familiar with that term. Traditionally, Christ the King Sunday is the Sunday before the first Sunday in Advent. So Advent starts next week, and it's recognised across many of the main Christian traditions. Now, when you think about these kind of Sundays and their special names and so on, we might be tempted to think, those have been around for hundreds of years. That sometime in the distant past, somebody came up with this special name for a particular day, Christ the King Sunday. But Christ the King Sunday is actually a relatively new one. It dates really from the early part of the 20th century. And it does come from the Roman Catholic tradition. But what happened is that in the aftermath of World War I, with the rise of communism in Russia and fascism in Italy, Pope Pius XI introduced this feast, Christ the King Sunday, to remind Christian people of their primary allegiance to Jesus. That before all earthly powers, before our consideration of who is in charge in the world, we have to understand that God is sovereign because Jesus reigns as our King. And we need to be challenged that our lives should reflect this, that Christ indeed is the King of our lives and the King of this world. Now, some Anglicans call this Sunday Stir Up Sunday because there's a little prayer that they would pray which talks about stirring up the wills of the people. Now, it's also called Stir Up Sunday because for those that make Christmas puddings, several weeks before Christmas, this is where you would stir if you're familiar with that, you say, I can see that people are going, now we know what you're talking about, John. Because this is the Sunday when you would stir your Christmas pudding in preparation for the coming of Christmas. So I'm going to stir us up a little bit today as we think about what it means to follow Jesus, as we think about mission, as we think about what it is for us, each of us, to be disciples of Jesus Christ in our daily lives. And as we think about what it is for Christ to be King. And we're going to do that by looking at these verses that Margaret read for us from the end of Matthew chapter 9 and into Matthew chapter 10. I've got 8 points. But don't be concerned. It's more like 8 statements than it is 8 points, okay? So don't be frightened about what I'm going to say. We're going to go quickly, which is what I do when I'm in that sort of mood to stir things up. So anyway, let's go, all right? So the first point is Jesus is King. Jesus is King. This is the absolute crux of the matter. On this banner here it says that we are living wholeheartedly as followers of Jesus for the transformation of the world. John, you're going to give it to me? Okay. Does that mean you're not listening to the sermon? Brilliant. So it says here, living wholeheartedly as followers of Jesus for the transformation of the world. Jesus is King. This means that we put Jesus first above all else in our lives. Matthew's gospel is all about the kingship of Jesus. And for the disciples, as you read right through Matthew's gospel, you see that the disciples, it's like a gradual process of the penny dropping in their minds, understanding who this guy Jesus is. And eventually they begin to realize Jesus is King. Jesus is King. He faces opposition from the religious leaders. There's all sorts of challenges that they face, but but Jesus becomes king of the lives of the disciples and of the lives of so many ordinary people. Last Sunday in Remembrance Day was the first occasion where I've been in a situation where I've sung the national anthem, God Save the King. And it's a little bit strange for us because we have been so used to, for all of our lives virtually, to sing God Save the Queen. And I remember thinking that it's a bit different, it's a bit strange. And of course, Charles is King of the United Kingdom. However, even he and anyone else that we might define as an earthly ruler is under the kingship of Jesus. Who we are, everything we do, all that we think is important to us in our lives, our priorities, our opinions, they're all subject to the kingship of Jesus. Jesus Christ is our King. The second thing, Jesus' focus is people, and he has compassion on his people. Jesus is the ultimate benevolent King. He is not in this for himself. He is the King who has come to serve. And at the beginning of our reading from the tail end of Matthew 9, it tells us that Jesus came proclaiming the good news of the kingdom. He came to heal. He came and he saw the crowds. He had compassion. He saw that they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus was filled with compassion for people. Jesus was filled for compassion for people for whom the religious institutions of the day were not helping. They were not reaching. They were not ministering to them in any shape or form. They were like without a shepherd, the great unwashed, those beyond the fringes of the church. That is who Jesus calls us to. In our own Methodist tradition, Wesley went beyond the fringes. That's what he found frustrating about the Church of England in his day, which he was so committed to. But he went to where people were. He didn't expect them to come in. He combined the proclamation of the good news with compassion for those who had the least. And this is the model of King Jesus. Jesus the King, his focus is on people, and he has compassion for people, especially those beyond the church. Jesus works in us and through us. Again, in this passage, he says to the disciples, living wholeheartedly as followers of Jesus for the transformation of the world, he says to the disciples, to us here, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. We are to join our King in his compassionate mission. He works in us and through us. I have no doubt that for many of us here, we have heard and received the good news of Jesus for years and years and years and years. And that means that we're on his team. There are no passengers. We are called to respond in service. There's no sorting ourselves out first and then going to serve. We are called to serve. And it's Jesus by his Spirit who is the one who ministers to us and brings us healing in our hearts and lives. And therefore we go and tell others and share it with those around us. And you know what? Even more than that, the fourth thing, Jesus works in us and through us, but Jesus gives us an authority, his authority. Chapter 10, verse 1, Jesus called the 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal disease and illness. And then it goes on and it names them. And then it says he sends them out. We'll come to that in a second or two. But he gives authority. And so for those of us who are disciples of Jesus, he gives us an authority to be his ambassadors, to be his disciples in the world around us. Now, we're all familiar with that kind of image of an ambassador, so the United Kingdom would send an ambassador to France, and that person would have the authority of the one who sent them in that place. And that is the same for us. Paul puts it like this in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. He talks about God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. So we are given an authority to be his followers in this world. And that is such good news for us. It's not good news if that's not what we want to do, but it is good news because actually God gives us the ability to be his witnesses, to be his ambassadors in the world around us. Jesus gives us an authority to act and to speak for him, to pray for those around us, and to proclaim and share the good news by what we say and what we do. Jesus gives us authority, and Jesus, I've hinted at it already, sends us out. Jesus sends us out as he sent the disciples out. Now, in that little passage, I don't know if you remember from the story, he says, do not go among the Gentiles or to any town of the Samaritans, go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. There's lots of debate in this passage, or about this passage, about what Jesus means here. Because in this particular moment, Jesus sends his disciples to their own people, their own ethnic group, as it were. And it's not that there wasn't a mission to others, because that's already been clear in Matthew. And it's even more clear at the end of the gospel, because after Jesus rises from the dead, he commissions and he sends his disciples to all nations. And we remember that, Matthew 28, go therefore to all nations and baptize them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. But if we have an interpretation of these verses for us today, it could be this: Jesus sends us to those around us, our everyday friends, our families, our neighbours, our colleagues, our acquaintances, people that we bump into. The key point is we are sent. We are sent. So it's not down to the person who is the ordained person just to be sent, or the people who come and work amongst us to be sent. We are all sent out to live and to serve God, live for God and serve God in this world. The next one, Jesus calls us to keep the main thing the main thing. Again, verses 9 through 15 in the reading that we heard, Jesus says, don't get any gold or silver or copper. Don't take an extra shirt or sandals. When you enter a village, search for a worthy person, a person of peace. Go and stay with them, and so on. And this, it kind of goes through. And again, there's lots of discussion around what is Jesus getting at when he sends his disciples in this way, in this passage. Well, some people think that he was thinking about potentially other religious groups. So there were people called cynics. They were philosophers who used to kind of travel around and speak as well. And they were known for carrying a staff and having bags and wearing sandals, right? And then there was another group called the Essenes, and when they travelled, they only stayed with other Essenes, so they wouldn't have stayed with anybody else. But Jesus was actually making something very clear to his disciples. He wanted them to be distinct. He didn't want them to be like these other groups. And so it is for us. We are to be different. We are to be distinct. We are to keep the main thing the main thing. And that is, we're not in this for a profit. We're not in this for self-fulfillment. We're not in this for self-gratification. We're not in this for our own agenda. We are focused on serving the King. We are focused on reaching the harassed and the helpless in our ministry as disciples of Jesus Christ. And everything else is incidental. And that's particularly hard for us in church when we have inherited ways of being and ways of doing over decades in our lives. We kind of think this is the way this is, or, church is, well, do you know what church is? Church is an hour on a Sunday morning. And that can be our way of thinking through what this is actually all about. But it's not what it's all about. Living wholeheartedly as followers of Jesus for the transformation of the world. That doesn't just emerge from being together for 1 hour on a Sunday. It comes from us living out our lives on a daily basis for the glory of Christ the King. And for many of us, that's a real challenge. That's hard. And Jesus is realistic about this too, because number 7, we're nearly there, I promise. Number 7 is Jesus is realistic about the challenges. Being his follower is not easy. Being his follower does not take all our troubles away. Being his follower does not result in life going the way we expect it to go, or life being filled with joy. Some of you know that a lot better than I do. Life can be a challenge for us, but living it for Jesus is the greatest thing that we can ever do. He said in verse 16, the very last one that we heard, I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be as shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. What does that mean? Well, this is a tough, challenging calling that we are called to follow Christ the King. We will face opposition. People will reject the message that we have in our hearts and lives. We require wisdom to know what to do, how to be, what to say. But in all of that, our motive must remain service. Service of Christ the King. And after that verse, and I didn't make Margaret read the whole of chapter 10. I thought I would stop there, but you can go and read it for yourselves. But I'm going to tell you some of the things that come after there. Because Jesus makes it clear there could be opposition from rulers and authorities. There'll be opposition from religious people. Even opposition from family. These are the things that you find when you put Christ first in your life. But even in the face of all of these challenges, the point is that the kingdom of God is distinctly different from the kingdoms of this world. And it's our calling to serve that kingdom. Towards the very end of chapter 10, verses 38 and 39, it says this, Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. We are called to give everything in the service of Christ the King. And point 8 is the same as point 1. Jesus is still the King. No matter what happens, no matter where we find ourselves, Jesus is still King Jesus. And we can trust King Jesus. This week, King Jesus is with us. Each day, King Jesus is with us. In the sorrows and in the joys, King Jesus is with us. On the good days and the difficult days, King Jesus is with us. In the mundane daily tasks, Jesus is with us. When we're having the most wonderful conversation with our neighbour, Jesus is with us. The point is, King Jesus calls us to follow and serve him. King Jesus wants us here in this place in Knockbreda Methodist to know and experience his compassion, to know and experience his love in our lives. King Jesus calls us to give everything, to share that love and that compassion that we've experienced with those around us. Let's bow our heads and we're going to pray. And perhaps just in the quietness of these moments, we reflect on King Jesus. and what it means for us to live wholeheartedly as followers of Jesus for the transformation of the world this week. What does that look like in our lives? What does that look like as we deal with the common ups and downs that life throws at us? Let's remember that King Jesus is still on his throne. Christ is the King.